Thank you. Please sit down. Now, Mr Moss, I think Commissioner Emmanuel has a question for you before you get on to your next point.
I do. Before you leave your last point, because I think it related to what you were speaking about before we immediately wrapped up, I just wondered if you wanted to comment about the union's submission that the cost of living impacts disproportionately on those who earn the minimum wage. So I think it's in UnionsWA's submission at around about paragraph 7.1, and WAIRC makes the same point as well.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Broadly speaking, CCI agrees with the views that the Minister expressed. CPI is the best indicator we have with respect to cost of living, and one does need to be a little bit cautious about the concept of unpacking CPI and looking at particular components in isolation. But I think one of the things is the WAIRC cost of living report is quite telling, and it's one of those things. The WAIRC cost of living report is usually forms part of WAIRC submission each year, and this year it's a notable exclusion. And one of the things when you look at this year's, or the 2015 report, is it shows that the standard of living for a low-paid household, as they define it, has improved significantly from the previous financial year. So when you look at that statement and then apply it to the hypothetical modelling that WAIRC used, they're not saying the same message. It's showing that things like the significant decrease in rental prices, the significant decrease in in transport costs, is having a significant impact on the cost of living standards, more so than, say, the increase in utility fees. So I think this is one of the concerns with trying to take apart CPI, is a lot of consideration is being put into how you measure the CPI increases. When you start unpacking it, for argument's sake, you're not necessarily taking into consideration the proportion of increases on total expenditure. So for argument's sake, you might look at the increase in utility prices and identify that that's around the 3.5% mark or something, so 3.8% that UnionsWA has identified, and I haven't looked at those figures, but we'll assume that that's correct. That 3.8% increase looks high, but the question then is, but what proportion of total spend is it? When you then consider something like decreasing in rental prices, which one would expect is a far greater proportion of total income spend than utility prices.
Yes, although they make the point, or somebody made the point in relation to that being the case if you enter into new rental accommodation in that particular period when rental arrangements decrease.
That's right. Although with respect to the declining rental market, one of the things that you're seeing at the moment is it's not just when you enter into a new rental agreement. The ability to renegotiate rental prices can occur at any particular point of time, particularly from a downward move. So one of the experiences that seems to be occurring from a real estate perspective is if you have an investment property, the worst possible thing you can have is that property untenanted, because then it is costing you money. And because of the high vacancy rates, there's increased pressure on landlords to be receptive to their tenants seeking rent reductions, because they know that tenants can move and get a better deal somewhere else. So in order to keep those tenants in there, then it's attractive for them to be prepared to negotiate on those. And particularly with a rental agreement, there's a clear point of time by which you can recommence those negotiations, but clearly is open for a tenant to negotiate that in on time. There's a fair bit on the internet encouraging tenants to negotiate good rental outcomes and giving them tips on how to negotiate rental outcomes. So it's not something that is necessarily lost on renters, generally speaking, as well. So you're seeing that that is passing through to existing tenants there as well, and interesting sort of way costs that have factored that into their own modelling, that those rental decreases are passing through. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Moss.
Yeah, thank you.
You were going to move to your next point.
Yes, thank you. With respect to the protecting those who are unable to reach industrial agreements, we think this as a consideration for the Commission is perhaps not as significant this year as has been in previous years, given the very low levels of wage price index. And I think that's particularly given into consideration that there's a certain lag effect with wage price index in that increases or guaranteed increases through enterprise bargaining doesn't move with market. So when you're doing an enterprise agreement, you will lock in wage rates for a given period of time, so commonly around the 3-year period, and it's very difficult to adjust those wage rates as market forces change, in particular where it's a downward force. So therefore, there's going to be a certain lag effect with existing agreements before they're renegotiated. So we can expect, probably reasonably thinking, that wage price index will decline further as market forces catch up with EBA negotiations. This basically, from our perspective, means that you're not seeing that those who are award reliant, the significant gap is increasing between that and average earnings. One of the things, however, that we are particularly cautious of is...
I'm sorry, so you're saying that those who are reliant on award wages, in reality, the gap between them and wage price index will contract?
Yes, yeah. So as you know, when we're looking at things like those who are on agreements, it takes a little bit of time for the effect of renegotiations to kick in. So one can reasonably expect that gap will start to decrease.
I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But one of the things we are concerned about is the flow-on effect of state wage case decisions on agreement outcomes, particularly where wage growth is moving in a downward fashion. There is a concern that a significant increase to the state minimum wage will then have a direct impact on bargaining outcomes. For argument's sake, from a union's perspective, it would be a poor bargaining outcome if you couldn't achieve at least the increase to the award wages in negotiations. So a high increase to the state minimum wage has a significant effect on bargaining outcomes, and at the moment, with the increased cost pressures on employers, the change in the market, we don't think that a high signal would have a positive effect on employment generally.
Pushing up the floor, in other words, Mr. Moss, is that right?
Yes, exactly. We also do take note of the data that the Minister has provided with respect to the decline in the number of apprenticeship and traineeships that are currently being entered into. That decline in apprenticeship and traineeship levels is reflected in CCI's own experience in providing services with respect to this particular area as well. There is a reduced demand by employers to look towards apprenticeship and traineeships. And this is largely a reflection of the current state of the economy and the labour market generally. But one of the things that we are concerned about is that a significant increase to award rates will provide a further disincentive to employers taking on apprentices and traineeships. In particular, we are concerned that a full increase, as proposed by UnionsWA, would have a disproportionate effect on the preparedness of employers to invest in the training of people. And we'll particularly take note of the submission of Mr. Williams I think one of the things that we noticed there is his grandson has clearly made a wise choice in moving into an apprenticeship. By taking a lower minimum rate, particularly in his first and second year of an apprenticeship, he's now set himself up very nicely as a skilled employee to be able to take the best advantages of the labour market. This apprentice has taken a short-term cost for a long-term gain. That's a wise decision indeed. We want to ensure that as many people as possible have the ability to take that option. At the moment, as a result of the declining labour market and the declining economy, employers aren't in a position to offer those opportunities to the same extent that we have been able to do previously. We don't want to see further barriers put in the way for that, and we think a large increase will definitely have that effect. We are also concerned that the proposal by UnionsWA, that no consideration has been given as to the practical means by which a structured outcome could occur. Our award systems currently are not set up towards a full increase being applied, and it would require quite a significant modification of the way in which those award clauses are structured and the way in which the state wage order is issued for such an effect to occur. And of course, one of the things that CCI is clearly concerned about is the impact of state minimum wage increases on employers, in particular those in the state system. It is clear that full-time jobs are falling. We're seeing a reduction in working hours. And this is a reflection of the falling demand for products and services, along with the pressures on businesses to reduce costs in order to be competitive in the market as employers face increased competition. In a tight economy, increased costs are unable to be passed on to clients and consumers, and as such it needs to be absorbed by the business. So clearly increased competition means there's an increased focus on price, so employers aren't in the same position to pass on increases. In the case of the retail and hospitality businesses most likely to be affected by this decision, labour costs represent 41% and 34% of their overall business costs, as identified in our submission and reply at paragraph 4.77. One of the unfortunate things is the employment costs is the expense that businesses are most easily able to control. Rental prices, utility costs are largely fixed. Small businesses have limited bargaining power with respect to negotiating lower costs in other areas. Therefore, this is the area that they're most likely to have the need to adjust costs, most able to reduce costs in. Research that the Fair Work Commission has carried out identifies the manner in which employers manage increases to increases the wage bill, at least in the short term. And that includes things such as reducing the hours of casual staff, reducing the number and length of shifts, increasing the number of hours worked by the owners of the business, and also increasing the number of hours worked by family members in the business, and reducing the number of employees, and frequently through natural attrition. And given the high turnover in the retail and hospitality industry, this is quite a viable option for many of these businesses. And we're also seeing through the CCI Business Expectations Survey and also elsewhere that employers are pessimistic regarding both the short and medium-term outlooks for the WA economy. Consequently, businesses are unlikely to be prepared to carry the cost of increased wages in the hope that the market will improve in the short term. Therefore, employers need to respond to increased costs.
I think there was a witness called a couple of years ago by UnionsWA, an academic, and
yes, from ECU?
Yes, who gave evidence about the responses of employers to increased costs and the way that they would revise their business operations and negotiate changed arrangements with staff.
Yeah, and I think one of the key messages which was identified in there was that a recognition that employers may well reduce the hours that the employee works, but that employees may well be receptive to such reductions if there was no net effect on income. So if the reduction in the hours worked was proportionate to the increase in wages, then those employees would be no worse off, actually, they would have a benefit in having reduced hours. Our concern with that hypothesis is it doesn't take into account the cost of an increase in wages on employers versus what an employee actually receives in take-home pay.
Well, it also doesn't give the employees a pay rise.
No. Actually, if anything, we think it probably gives them a reduction in take-home pay, because if you have a $12 increase to wages, that has a compounding effect when you add on super and other employment costs. So the cost to the employer is higher than $12. When you then take take taxation out of that $12 as gross income, then the employee's net income is significantly reduced. The employer will adjust hours based on what it costs them, not what the employee receives. So therefore, the reduction in hours that the employee receives will probably be greater than the net benefit they achieve through the increased wages. Consequently, they are likely to lose out in that scenario. So we're concerned there's some slight flaw in some of that logic that goes behind that assumption. And I think this is one of the reasons why we stress when we're looking at the impact of the increases to wages, it's not just the impact on employment, but it can also be the impact on the hours that an employee works, because that also has an impact upon the total take-home pay. So for the small businesses who are covered by the state system, our concern is that their minimum cost of employment are already higher than those businesses in the national system. And small business, by and large, also face a number of significant other challenges, which is reflected in things like the lower business survival rate for small businesses and the higher level of default on loans and creditors. This is a market that we're in at the moment is clearly one which employers have a limited ability to bear increased employment costs without the effects of those increases being felt by their employees. And this is the concern, is there's nowhere else that the employer can pass the increased costs on other than reducing the overall cost. And that's going to, at the end of the day, impact upon employees. CCI believes that the fundamental shift in the state of the economy means that the justification for maintaining the difference between the state and national minimum wage doesn't exist to the extent it did before. And as such, the two should be brought closer into alignment. And I think this is further supported when one considers that private sector businesses covered by the state system are small businesses which are facing strong competition. For the low paid, the shift in the market means there's an increased focus on maintaining their employment. And this is a more important factor than wage increases. Low-skilled employees are unfortunately the most vulnerable to the loss of hours of work. For those low-paid workers in low-income households, the impact of lost work opportunities will have the most significant effect, with employment providing them with the best option for improving their standard of living. In the current market, the risk of unemployment and underemployment is a significant possibility. And as shown in the WAIRC cost of living reports, the standard of living of those reliant on social security payments is significantly lower than those who are in paid employment. Over the recent past 5 years, award-reliant employees have benefited from significant real wage growth, with state minimum wage increasing by 15.8% compared to 11.7% growth in per CPI over the same period of time. So the boom years have resulted in a state minimum wage which provided a real increase in the wages of those who are low paid. With the current low levels of inflation, maintenance of the current minimum wage will continue to meet the needs of the low paid. It will still result in an improved living standard, particularly compared to inflation over that period. So the real wage growth from previous years ensures that they're able to meet their needs for a relative standard of It also helps moderate the pressure on employers to reduce working hours. In the current environment, helping to maintain employment and working hours provides the best means, we think, of improving living standards overall. We also think that, to the extent that the Commissioner is of the mind to provide an increase to the state minimum wage, a flat increase is a better outcome than the percentage-based increase. We believe that the increase, that a flat dollar increase provides a more targeted approach to addressing the needs of the low paid, whilst minimising the impact of increased employment costs. As has been identified, the Minister has also identified or proposed a change to the traineeship provisions, where the awards refer to the National Training Wage Award. CCI doesn't object to the updating of these rates to address the unintended consequence of National Training Wage Award being frozen, subject to the concerns that we've expressed with respect to how that is flagged in the case of businesses. We're very much concerned that in only changing the state wage order, private sector employers will not know what rate of pay they need to provide with. Private sector employers, most employers generally, will look at the wage schedule and look at the wage rates within the award. They're not going to troll through the order to see whether there's anything there that they need to be aware of. If it's not flagged obviously for them, it will be missed, and as such they're going to be non-compliant. Okay? And one thing that CCI can't support is a change to the awards which leaves employers in a position where they are unintendedly going to be non-compliant because the information there is not obvious for them. Now, I'll clarify that our concerns with respect to private sector, not with respect to public sector awards. Within the public sector awards, there's a preference not to make those changes for various reasons. We have no particular concern or problem with respect to that, in the fact that we expect with the coverage of industrial agreements within the public sector, references to the award are likely to be fairly limited, and to the extent they are still live, the public sector has the means by which they can navigate the system appropriately. That's not the case with the private sector businesses, particularly small businesses, which are largely going to be reliant on what's on the website. They may not be members of employer associations, so they've got limited sources of avenue for that information.
Can I just put to you that you indicated that in your written submission that you believe the relevant clauses should be updated to insert the appropriate minimum rates of pay, or alternatively to direct the relevant party to the minimum wage order. I wonder if you might, in the near future, speak with the Minister's representatives and UnionsWA to see if you can come up with a form of words to be included into award clauses, because the minimum wage order affects all of the awards, and their schedules are amended. Mm. So it might be helpful if we can have a standardised form of words.
Yeah.
That's agreed.
There is a broader issue with respect to the way in which various state awards treat traineeships, because there's not a level of consistency. A lot of the state awards are fairly outdated with respect to their referencing to traineeships, in particular referencing to old styles of traineeships which haven't been around for some time.
Yes.
I certainly think there is potentially a benefit to looking at having a standardised traineeship clauses across all of the state or relevant state awards where traineeships are appropriate, and that they deal with it in a consistent manner.
I can see some work for you then, Mr. Moss.
Yes, and I'm not sure that that's an achievable task within the confines of this state wage, because I expect that will open up a fair degree of discussion about how different how traineeships fit in different awards and those types of things. For the awards that the Minister has identified, they all seem to treat the traineeships in the same way. They all reference the National Training Wage Award,
Yes.
Other than with a couple of matters, the National Training Wage Award doesn't deal with, or didn't deal with, terms and conditions of employment, other than with respect to who pays training costs. It largely sets the rates of pay. So we think that there's an ability to simply continue to reference the National Training Wage Award, so for any other conditions that might be relevant, to incorporate, to identify, however, the minimum rates of pay for a trainee shall be the following, and inserting the traineeship rates from the state wage order. The Minister identified that there's potentially one group where the award rate is higher. I must admit, in trying to identify that, I couldn't find that, as far as I could see, all of the rates in the National Training Wage were lower than the state wage order. But there is some confusion about trying to track down old versions of the National Training Wage Award to make sure you've got the right one. So that we might need to look at that. But to the extent that there are rates in the old National Training Wage Award which is higher than they could be flagged and grandfathered, would be how we view that could occur. But on my examination, I don't think there's anything there to be grandfathered. They're all lower, as far as I can see.
Well, perhaps a discussion between the three of you might be useful.
Yes, and I think we'll definitely take the opportunity and hopefully come back on a consented opinion. Because our real concern is that small businesses employers won't know how to find it.
Yes.
And it does actually identify an issue when I was trying to look for it earlier on what those rates on the National Training Wage Award would be, and it took me a good half an hour to find them myself. I suspect most private sector employers won't have the patience for doing that. May it please the Commission, I'd like to conclude our initial oral submissions at that point, subject to right of reply, unless there's any further questions from the bench.
Mr. Moss, you opened with some treatment of the gap between the national minimum wage and the state minimum wage, and expressed a concern on the part of the CCI that was growing, or you were looking to limit its growth, the gap.
Yeah.
Am I to understand your argument that it is that it might be counterproductive for that gap to remain or grow on the basis that businesses might incorporate where they otherwise wouldn't, to take advantage of the lower minimum wage at the national level?
That's certainly a point. So our positions would like to see a decrease in that gap. Yes.
My question is why?
Why? It really comes down to who's affected by the state wage case order. And when we're looking at the private sector, it is unincorporated business, so sole traders, partnerships. They, by definition, tend to be small businesses rather than larger businesses in that respect.
Yeah.
And so whilst, we can see, there's clear logic as to why there is a differential, and that differential is largely being premised on the state of the WA economy versus the state of the national economy, as the objectives of the state wage case objectives direct the Commission to look at. It gives from our perspective, a perverse outcome that the minimum wage for small business is higher than the minimum wage for big business or larger businesses. So, from a fairness perspective, why are small businesses having to pay more than larger businesses who can take account of economies of scale, have better market forces and things like that? The outcome from the perspective of our members, and bearing in mind our members are looking at this decision not from the prism of the state wage case objectives, they're just simply looking at it from the prism of what does it mean for my business. The outcome for them doesn't make sense.
So it's a matter of fairness rather than us being concerned, if that's the right word, about an increase or a failure to address the gap being counterproductive because small business might decide to incorporate.
Well, and there is a discussion to be had with respect to that, and that's probably a broader one with respect to.
Well, humour me with it. Why do the small businesses just decide to stay in the state system rather than incorporate, in your experience?
Largely tax reasons. So usually the corporate structure the business adopts is based on the advice they receive from their accountant.
But it's always a choice for any business to incorporate or not.
And it's a relatively low threshold to incorporate. It's around $2,000 to $3,000 for a business to incorporate. So consequently, there's not a high bar to incorporating.
And are businesses incorporating to avoid the gap between the national minimum wage and the state minimum wage?
Our experience is that by and large businesses don't adopt their corporate structure based on IR outcomes. So, no, being the obvious word. At least that's our impression. Usually when we're talking to members about, well, why have you adopted the business structure that you have, it's usually coming out of advice that they've received from their accountants or financier as to what's the best or most appropriate way of structuring their business. So, no, we're not necessarily seeing people jurisdiction hopping by adjusting their corporate structure. Bearing in mind that for those businesses where, businesses that can be a consideration for them. But there usually is other more pressing reasons why that's the case. So, to answer your question, we're not seeing people move because of that. The question is, what impact does that have on their business and their ability to compete with those businesses which are incorporated?
I suppose it has the effect which they, guided by their financial advisors, choose it to have.
Yeah, and one of the concerns, of course, is financial advisors tend not to look at... So when financial advisors are providing advice, they're not looking at the IR system. They tend to be looking at the taxation system. So the advice that financial advisors are providing are locked within a particular paradigm, and that is what's the most appropriate structure to structure a business based on the taxation implications, reporting requirements that exist, because of course one of the issues for incorporating is you're then covered by the Corporations Act, and that has reporting requirements on small businesses which are more onerous than what exists if you're operating as a sole trader or a partnership. So financial advisors or taxation accountants will provide advice based on their particular paradigm without looking at the implications outside of that. Okay? So, for example, when we're coming in and saying, well, look, these are the implications of that, those structures are laid in place, and once you've set your business up on a particular structure, it requires quite a conscious effort to move that over. So, so whilst theoretically, yes, you could move, that's not the experience. Yeah. And so therefore, they need to deal with the system that they're in.
So insofar as prima facie it looks unfair that an employee gets paid less under the national minimum wage than they might under the state minimum wage, in addressing the fairness to the employer, we would have to take into account some other factors.
Yeah, and now, whilst, sort of being fairly clear from our members' perspective, this is one of the concerns they have with respect to fairness. I'd like to reiterate that as we've tried to identify within our submissions and submissions in reply, we believe that maintenance of the state minimum wage and award rates at the current levels would not only result in better fairness to small businesses, but it would also comply with the other requirements of state wage case objectives as well. And so we're not asking the Commission to ignore the other objectives simply to focus on that. Clearly that's not a viable option for the Commission, but we think that the economic circumstances facing the state economy at the moment is identifies that is probably a reasonable course of action, certainly from our perspective, in meeting the other objectives within the state wage case, particularly given that one of the core reasons, or one of the significant reasons for the maintenance of that, or the establishment of that difference, was the strength of the WA economy versus the national, which we're seeing is changing significantly.
And you may have thereby answered my other question, but I asked Mr. Christmas about whether there was an opportunity here to allow low-paid workers to catch up with the better-paid workers by a relatively modest increase in the state minimum wage because the wage price index is so low at the moment.
And that concern...
And whilst it might, if you were just looking at the needs of the low-paid, present that opportunity to allow them to catch up by a relatively modest increase, you would say that if we were to look at the interests of small business and the economy as a whole, that in fact it could have a deleterious effect on the low paid.
Yeah, and in two ways. The first is, as I mentioned earlier, low paid, and so you equate low paid with low skilled, and that's generally the way that it looks at it. Low skilled employees are more easily substituted than high skilled employees. So if you're increasing the rate of pay for low skilled above what high skilled employees would receive, then it becomes more viable for an employer to substitute the low skilled workers with the high skilled workers. So the high skilled workers will just pick up more duties, lower paid duties. It's more easily able to absorb that, and that's one of the issues that Mr. Christmas identified. The other issue of concern is the signalling effect that an increase to the state minimum wage has on agreement or wage outcomes across the board. So one of the things that we identified within our state wage and our regional submissions was a survey which indicated a proportion of businesses which will flow on state wage case increases to maintain that difference. So, you know, whilst the increase might...
industrial agreements, you mean?
Well, not... the flow-on effect does have an implication for the industrial agreements, but it also has an implication for above-board increases as well. So a lot of businesses will look at... so we get a lot of requests about what is the increase that being granted through the state or national wage case. Not because the employees that they engage are award-based, rather it has a signalling effect as to what is a reasonable increase in wages. So a high increase in wages to the state wage case will have a signalling effect as to what should be the increase of wages more generally speaking. So that flow-on effect will mean that that high increase won't necessarily reduce that gap if it signals up and everyone then moves along.
Is that an argument which says to us that the low paid can never catch up?
In essence, yes. It's difficult.
So isn't it the job of employers and so on to say there are reasons why the low paid got an increase of X dollars and we're not giving you the same increase in percentage or real terms for these reasons? Doesn't the onus pass to employers to make the argument, rather than us to not grant an increase to avoid having to make that argument?
The issue comes down to the way in which the impact of employers not passing on passing on a lower increase to skilled workers versus unskilled workers, the impact of that has on the morale of the skilled workers, which are, I must admit to be frank, are more valuable to the organisation. So the skilled workforce is the workforce that the organisation has the greatest investment in and the greatest need to, for want of a better word, keep motivated. To say, look, we value you less by giving you a lower increase than those people who don't have the same skills there isn't generally a practical option in that respect.
Well, then you come to the argument of compression of relativities, don't you?
Yes. Yeah. And which, I know we're arguing for a flat dollar increase. And that's largely because, one of the, if they're wanting to target the minimum wage, a flat dollar increase. So a flat dollar increase seems the same signalling method. So a flat dollar increase of, say, so I'll use the Minister's submission as an example. A flat dollar increase of $8 per week sends a signal that the appropriate wage increase is $8 a week, whereas an increase of 1.25% sends a signal that the appropriate increase is 1.25%. And of course, the more you earn, then the greater the value of the 1.25% is. So if you're looking at signalling effects, a flat dollar increase is probably a better outcome as far as delivering a more measurable percentage-based increase to the low paid than it is to the higher paid.
Thank you.
I just wondered if I could ask you a quick question there. How does that idea that the flow-on costs, or rather the flow-on effect of an increase in circumstances where it's not obligatory and you're talking about giving it to non-award-reliant, non-minimum wage workers, how does that sit with the notion you were talking about in terms of employers having limited ability to control the costs and passing on effectively the costs to employees by lowering their employmental hours. But you're still saying that the flow-on effect would be that employers would feel compelled to pass on increases.
That's right. So, and just coming back to the concept of industrial relations and the raising of dispute and dealing with disputes. If the argument is, yes, for this subgroup of workers who have less skills, we're giving this increase, which is more significant than the increase or no increase for the more highly skilled workers, then that in essence, whether formally or informally, creates a level of discomfort or disputation within the workplace. And the employer needs to try and resolve that issue. That puts pressure on the employer to have to increase the wages, notwithstanding they're not in a position to be able to do so. So if you're increasing wages, then you have to cut back on costs in another way. And of course, the most easy way of doing that would be to reducing hours. What we're seeing in the market at the moment is employers don't have that flexibility. And that's why we're seeing wage price index go down, because there's a clear incapacity of employers to provide any significant wage increases. So that's why we're starting to see a decline in wage price index. So, in essence, a high state wage case decision, which in essence seeks to try and, it would have the effect of putting pressure on the employers to provide higher increases than what they're otherwise capable of providing, creates a difficulty from the market perspective. How as an employer do you reconcile the two different outcomes? So our concern at the moment is everything is pointing towards a contraction of wage growth, a contraction of inflationary pressures, a contraction of economic growth, a increase to the state minimum wage which defies our trends, creates a level of disharmony.
Thank you, Mr. Moss.
Thank you.
Dr. Diamond.
May please the Commission in court session. So this is the first time I've presented before the Commission, or indeed any Commission case of any substantial length. So I feel I should apologise in advance for any mistakes or stumbles I might make.
Well, thank you, Dr. Diamond, but I suspect from my observation of you during the course of a number of state wage cases that you've had an influence in otherwise than standing on your feet, so there's no need for you to feel concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. But as I say, if there's any stumbles I make, please feel free to point them out to me. So UnionsWA will be relying on its written submissions and, of course, its written submissions in reply. I'll try not to repeat too much here. Rather, I'll try and focus on a few key points as part of our case for an increase in the minimum wage. So UnionsWA is contending that the Commission in court session should make a substantial real wage increase for award-reliant workers. And this is essential to address the ever-widening gap between low-paid workers, and the rest of the workforce in WA. Therefore, UnionsWA is advocating that the Commission increase award wages and the statutory minimum wage in the state system by $30 a week at the lower award rates from C14 to C10, and by 3.9% for the higher rates. Now, what we're in basically attempting a double-barrelled structure, if I could put it like that, for our increase. What we're trying to do is address the arguments of a focused improvement, if you like, for the lowest paid, coming out of the state wage case, but at the same time also being mindful to maintain award relativities and maintain what's often called the margin for skill with award rates. And insofar as people on the lower award rates might be on a path to higher award rates, it's important that their relativities in the award system actually reflect that. So essentially our proposed increase for the lowest rate would be a change of around 4.4% at the very lowest rate, so the C14 rate, which would be an increase in the hourly rates by about 79 cents. And as you go all the way up to the higher award rates, you're still basically an increase of essentially under $1 for those higher hourly rates. The state government's proposed change, which amounts to about $8.50 per week as a flat rate, we don't regard as an adequate increase. We don't regard it as an adequate increase for reasons I'll go into, but essentially around the simply maintaining the simply matching it to CPI inflation. We don't regard as fulfilling the requirements of the Act. For the Chamber of Commerce's claim to essentially have no increase, we also don't regard as meeting the needs of the low paid or contributing to improved living standards, and its alternative formulation of an increase below the current level of inflation and any increase granted by the Fair Work Commission in the national minimum wage is also would not meet the needs of the low paid or contribute to improved living standards. The Commission has in previous years essentially recognised that a zero increase does not meet the considerations of the Act. And while the WA Government's claim certainly concedes the need for an increase, we don't believe that the level they're proposing would meet the needs of the low paid or contribute to improved living standards. Now, UnionsWA is basing its claim and basing the amount of its claim on the continuing disparity and the continuing growing disparity between the minimum wage and average weekly earnings at both the state and the national level. That's why we're arguing that an increase in $30 a week is essentially needed in order that the growing gap between average weekly earnings and the minimum wage is arrested. The increases awarded by the Commission since 2006, despite recording slight improvements in the bite of the national minimum wage for average weekly earnings in 2012 and 2014, have not been sufficient to reverse what we see as the decline in relative standards. The gap between the low paid and those of other workers is large and has been growing. Minimum wages are substantially lower than they would be if the minimum wage bite had been held constant, resulting in the living standards of low wage workers, in our view, being too low relative to those of other workers. Now, just as an aside, the reason why we are emphasising the measure of average weekly earnings, in contrast to the other parties who are focusing on the wage price index, is not that we discount the influence of the wage price index. It's certainly an important measure and something the Commission should be paying attention to. What we argue is that the wage price index does not allow the Commission to consider the compositional issues of earnings in the labour market that it is required to do under the other considerations in the Act. So, for example, considerations like the gender pay gap, equal pay for work of equal and comparable value. These things essentially disappear from consideration if you can't look at average weekly earnings. And we would argue that when you're looking at what people are actually paid out there, if I put it like that, in the workforce, you need to consider measures of average weekly earnings and you need to consider them in comparison, or if you like, setting it up with the minimum wage. So our argument is that in the period since 2006, where there has been a regular decline in the minimum wage bite, what you've seen in that period of time is that measures of inequality such as the gender pay gap and the Gini coefficient of equivalised disposable household income have been essentially getting worse for Western Australia, and for Australia too, I might add. So, for example, in the gender pay gap in WA, in May 2006, it was about 24.4%. and in May 2015 it's 26.1%. So certainly WA had a large gender pay gap to begin with, but it's noticeably been getting worse while the minimum wage bite has been declining.
I had thought, and perhaps you can correct me, I had thought the gender pay gap in WA had reduced a little compared with the national.
There had been a smaller drop-off in the most recent years.
Yes.
However, we would argue that the trend, if you look from 2006 to 2015, is still broadly going up. While you can point in particular years to a particular volatility that might lead to a particular improvement, some of that is due to the fact that what we use from the Australian Bureau of Statistics are the original figures, which sort of tend to be a little bit more volatile. However, it remains the case that the WA gender pay gap is persistently larger than the national one, and in our view, the overall trend is still to go up.
Are you talking to pages 8 and 9 of the original written submissions of UnionsWA?
I believe if those are my page references.
You've got some tables there, and I wonder if the figures you're quoting are being lifted from those tables.
Yeah, so you'll see, rather than read out all of the tables, what I'm doing is I'm actually jumping essentially from 2006 to 2015. Certainly you can see one of the highest ones we recorded was in 2011. Gender pay gap I'm talking about. That would be 28.2. We managed to there was a improvement in the gap the following year, which then bounced back up again in 2013, down a bit in 2014, up a bit in 2015.
So you're talking about trend terms?
I was talking in trend terms, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
And I would say that in trend terms as well, if you look at the table directly below that on the Gini coefficient, you can see the trend. You can see the trend in equivalent household disposable income inequality has been growing during this period of time as well. Now, it's with this situation in mind that UnionsWA has decided to make the claim for a $30 a week increase in the WA minimum wage at that lowest level. And really, should this claim be granted by the Commission, and what we calculated, an admittedly crude calculation of average weekly earnings increasing by an average amount, then the state minimum wage bite really would be maintained at its 2015 level, which would be about 40.2% of average weekly earnings. Mr. Christmas certainly can attest to the difficulties of forecasting, but nevertheless it seemed to us to be a reasonable statement to say that what we're asking for is really essentially a holding pattern, if I could put it like that, based on the current trajectory of average weekly ordinary time earnings. So UnionsWA submits that given the increase in living costs that impact disproportionately on low-wage workers, and the recent increases in living costs that were based on the WA budget, an increase in the minimum above CPI inflation levels is required. Now, UnionsWA is contending, once again in contrast to the other parties, that the CPI inflation headline level is an incomplete measure for the financial needs of workers on low pay and their families. And this isn't simply a claim that we're making, it's backed up by any number of studies that look specifically at the experiences of low-wage workers. So, for example, we extract a study by Helen Masterman-Smith, Robin Ray and Barbara Pocock. It's a study of childcare workers, and we refer to that in our initial submission. Basically, they found that the experiences of low pay costs these workers a great deal. in worry and persistent anxiety about bills, ill health, concern for their children, and denial of participation in the kinds of activities that many Australians take for granted. Sport, visiting friends, training, job search, the prospect of secure housing, and the hope of retirement without poverty. And I'll address sort of retirement earnings in a moment. So for these workers, basically low pay narrows and constricts their social circles, it restricts travel, and it affects children's access to school excursions. And it also has some, also raises issues about addressing basic health costs. And working poverty, or working low pay, is also associated with things like the deferral of family formation and relationship tensions around money in some households. So therefore, the makers of this study reject the easy assumption about shared household earnings protecting against individual poverty. It's often not supported in many examples. Some low-paid workers live with other low-paid workers or live in households with others where the income is simply not shared. So we certainly agree with the proposition that we shouldn't stereotype workers who are on the minimum wage or on low pay, and it is precisely for that reason that we would ask the Commission to consider consider the status of low-wage workers as individuals, as individual wage earners, as people who are entitled to a decent wage in the community, and as the access in the context of fair labour standards generally when you're coming to your decision. So, as the Commissioner outlined, in paragraphs 7.4 to 7.7 in our initial submission, you'll see a selection of recent expenditure group CPI increases for the past 12 months to March 2016. Now, you'll see there we've picked out things like childcare costs, medical and hospital services, electricity. Now, is it a selection? Yes, it most certainly is. There's no doubt about that. And it's selection based as best we can on long-established research about the needs of the low-paid. And when we're talking about the needs of the low-paid, what we're arguing is the low-paid have needs that are distinctive enough within the broader community of wage earners that they are acknowledged in the Industrial Relations Act and as part of the considerations for the state wage case. So the Commission is asked to consider distinctively what the interests of low-wage workers are. So the distinctive need of low-wage workers is not simply that they get a job, because everybody basically needs to get a job. There's very few people in the country who can get by without getting a job. You've also got to think about what distinctively sets out what are the distinctive needs of the low paid in the community. And when we talked about the range of increases that we put in the table in our initial submission, we found that an increase of $30 per week, or roughly 4.4% at the C14 level, would be equivalent to about a median increase when you consider all of the factors that we listed. Now, is it open to argument about precisely what we've selected? Certainly, there's no doubt about that. But we think we came as close as best we could to coming up with a distinctive range of needs that are distinctive, should be distinctively emphasised, not unique, but distinctively emphasised for the low paid. Because as one of the respondents in the low paid survey, which we included in our initial submission, one of them said, low pay is a constant source of stress. You're always calculating whether you have to choose between paying the power bill or the phone, or if the car breaks down, or if somebody loses a job. And that's for somebody who earned between $17.40 and $40 an hour. Now, that's one person's view, certainly, but it's the sort of view that is consistent with the cited research, and there has been quite a bit of research on what the needs of the low paid are. So our argument is that a headline CPI figure simply does not capture the full impact of cost increases for low-paid workers. And if you like, the classic basket of goods that the ABS uses when it's calculating these sorts of things is itself based on a sufficient number of assumptions that we shouldn't simply apply it to low-wage workers. Now, in terms of, for example, protecting employees who may be unable to reach an industrial agreement, UnionsWA has submitted a report by the Workplace Research Centre called Minimum Wages and Their Role in the Process and Incentive to Bargain, shows that minimum wage increases are far more likely to encourage rather than discourage bargaining. Workers in the state system will also be most impacted by the minimum wage increase, are also in those categories of worker who are less likely to be able to negotiate their own pay and conditions, and that's explained in our initial submission. Now, we've just...
In fact, I would have thought those who are employed in small businesses are less able to be organised by unions, less able to bargain together with others, and therefore their bargaining capacity, because of the nature of their employment or the nature of their employer, is affected.
That certainly has been our experience, most definitely. In that sense, a minimum wage increase does have a signalling effect. We cite that ourselves. Yes, it certainly does have a signalling effect, and we're pleased that it does have that signalling effect, because it definitely, what we have found, particularly when we've gone out, and once again I cite our low-paid survey, is that yes, there's a lot of need. There is a great deal of need for people to understand, A, that there is a minimum wage, that there are certain award rates that they need to be paid, and a minimum wage increase, ideally highly publicised, will most certainly begin to set the standard for those workers. Now, on the point of encouraging ongoing skills development, once again you'll see in the section of our initial submission that we put in a number of details about the costs through state training providers. However, we would argue that apprenticeship and trainee wages in the state system do need that substantial increase in order to encourage participation in skills development. And taking the example of the Mr. George Williams' story regarding his grandson, yes, his grandson certainly has made a wise decision to upgrade his skills. That will pay off in the long run. But it remains the case that not everybody is in a position where they would be able to keep on working for such a low wage in the effort of improving their skills down the track. Once again, you've got things like family considerations, considerations for people who may have childcare responsibilities, people just simply, even the prospect of down the track some sort of higher wage, some sort of higher living standard, if you defer the costs now for your training, aren't going to be very good for you if you simply can't survive on the wage that you're getting right now. And notwithstanding that you might earn something better down the track, the fact remains that people drop out of apprenticeships and traineeships if they simply can't survive on what it is that they're getting. And that is something that the Commission should consider. So as previously mentioned, WA has the highest gender pay gap of any Australian state, and an increase to the minimum wage that simply matches or indeed is below CPI inflation is going to make the situation, we would argue, worse rather than contribute to its improvement. And it cannot, and as I mentioned earlier, workers as individuals is a valid consideration for the minimum wage, and it cannot be assumed by the Commission in court session that inequality within households is a reason to discount a minimum wage increase. So in previous wage cases, the high gender pay gap in WA has been attributed to the mining boom impact on resource industry wages. However, even in the aftermath of what we regard as the boom, which is essentially the construction phase, if we could put it broadly like that, we would argue that the reduction in the gender pay gap the improvement, if you want to call it that, has been marginal at best. And as we discussed earlier, the overall sort of trajectory has been sort of upwards, and it remains so. UnionsWA contends that when considering the impact of gender pay gaps, the Commission should bear in mind that they also represent a career-long penalty for women. So it's not just a question of it's okay if you get a low wage now because you'll move into a higher bracket later on. It's actually something that's reflected in prospective lifetime earnings. And in our initial submission, we refer people to a recent Senate Economics References Committee report. A husband is not a retirement plan, achieving economic security for women in retirement. The reason we bring up this particular report is that it's a useful sort of demonstration or dramatisation, if you like, of the impact of inequalities within households, effectively. A husband is not a retirement plan, or a husband is not an income support plan either. Gendered financial inequality within households is an issue for both the current and the future remuneration of women. And the minimum wage should play its part in addressing that issue through an increase that ensures it does not slip further behind average weekly earnings. So UnionsWA has also submitted that those industries which are more likely to be in the state's industrial relations system appear more likely than not to have had some sort of comparable wages growth that's better. I'll start that again. UnionsWA submitted that those industries which are more likely to be in the state industrial relations system have had some better or at least comparable employment growth than that at the state as a whole. Now, we saw from Mr Christmas's submission that most recently there's been a mixed picture, but however there's no evidence in that previous minimum wage increases or having a minimum wage higher than the national wage has adversely impacted the WA economy in those areas. So to finish up this statement, I'll go to addressing some broad points. The revised industry skills list level that the Minister submitted, UnionsWA has no objections to that particular arrangement. The submission on trainees under state awards which reference the National Training Wage Award. Look, UnionsWA is broadly supportive of the Minister's sort of initial offer, if I could put it like that, or initial statement. We certainly take on board what the Chamber of Commerce has said about the need to ensure sort of there's adequate information out there. And certainly we'd be happy to undertake discussions with the other parties about the best way of doing that. Our sense, though, would be that we probably favour something that's closer to the Minister's original position, if I could put it like that, insofar as just sort of working off simplicity. But we're certainly happy to have a discussion about that.
Thank you, that would be helpful.
And look, beyond that, that is sort of all I'd like to say at this point, but I'm happy to take questions from the bench.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, if I may. Dr. Diamond, I refer to that table on page 8 of the original written submission. Do you have that? I do. So it's got there in that the complete table, and then got the page, the WA full-time average weekly earnings as reported in May each year. The increase from 2012 to 2013 was about $128, and then in 2013 to 2014 was $3. Is that right?
Which year are we looking at here?
So from 12 to 13, I've got an increase being $128, and then from 13 to 14, I've got the increase being a decrease of $3 in average weekly earnings. Did you?
Oh yes, I see what you mean.
Are you
looking in WA or?
Yes, WA. WA full-time average weekly earnings May each year as reported or assessed in May each year. Is the information in the table correct?
The information is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics.
Okay, so it's not a typo. They went down by $3 in the year 13-14.
I'm sorry, I'm actually having a bit of a trouble seeing that. So you've got for 2013.
So
Sorry, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, look,
my first question is whether the information you sought to have recorded in that list is correct.
That is, well, look, that is correct.
Okay.
We've got it from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but I'm happy to go back and check that out.
And I'll proceed on the assumption that it's correct.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that average weekly earnings have become a little bit volatile in recent years, going up by 128 in one year, down by 3 the next, then back up by 50. Your calculation has it in May 2016 being $1,764.80. Is that right?
Yes.
So an increase of $73.
Yes.
And you calculated on the basis of the average.
On basis of an average going back.
Right. So insofar as you say that a $30 increase will be required to maintain that 40.2%, you are predicting an increase in average weekly earnings between May 2016 and May 2017 of $73.
That was our estimate.
All right. And Mr. Christmas said that they don't do forecastings for average weekly earnings.
That's correct.
All right. But your argument is predicated upon that being the...
Our argument is predicated on an assumption that there will be a growth in average weekly earnings. The small slide back that you spoke about in the previous section has nevertheless sort of an increase resumed and a reasonably steady increase resumed after that point. Look, we may be wrong. There's no doubt about that. We might be wrong. However, we are assuming that there will be growth, and we are making a claim based on the belief that what we'd like to do is roughly maintain the proportion. This seemed like the best proportion that we could work at, given the resources available.
All right, thank you. One other question. You asked some questions of Mr. Christmas about what are the drivers of discretionary spending. Could you just explain to me if there's a submission that's based on those questions of Mr. Christmas, or
The questions I was asking Mr. Christmas?
yes, what was that all about?
Well, what I was proposing is that low wage growth, and it's accepted that we have low wage growth in Australia at the moment, is detrimental, if you like, to household spending levels and household consumption levels. As Mr. Christmas says, there are a number of different variations on that, but a fairly basic one would be, do people have a job? Are people getting paid a decent amount? The fact that during a period of time in which wages growth, as measured by the wage price index, has been declining, and we see a decline in discretionary spending. And if you recall some of the details that we mentioned when we talked about the needs of low pay, some of that does move into the category of discretionary spending. Some of it, indeed, when you're talking about the low pay, the discretion that they have to exercise is a discretion often between necessities as well. You know, do you get petrol for the car? Can you take the kids to work? Kids to school. Sorry, not to work. All of those things are reflected in basically our wages growing at a reasonable level. We would argue, and I think we say in our initial submission, that we regard a lot of the wage growth as currently recorded as extremely low. We quote the Secretary of the Treasury, John Fraser, who's indicated that low wage growth is not simply a question of concern for the workers themselves. It actually has broader macroeconomic consequences If people aren't spending.
Well, I did wonder if you were planning to develop an argument that wages growth was needed to, in some way, kickstart the economy. Are you developing that submission?
In our initial submission, we certainly quote research that suggests that low-wage workers are certainly far more likely to spend what they earn. In that sense, we would argue that increases to the minimum wage, and once again increases that reflect that signalling effect that we've talked about, do arguably have a stimulatory effect on economic activity. Given the decline in business investment, or sort of the diminishing perhaps significance of business investment in overall economic growth, we would argue that domestic spending, people's household consumption, all of those sorts of things clearly is something that needs to step up and take a lot more significance within the overall economic picture. It has to, if we're indeed expecting that business investment is not going to be the sort of the powerhouse that it's been up until this point. The activity needs to come from somewhere. And the obvious way to do that, the obvious source of that is people spending. Now, the objection is often made that people are likely to save, or perhaps people are likely to pay off debts. Look, myself, I would say that if people are in fact getting themselves out of debt, that's not necessarily a negative outcome, I would say. But it's also the case that particularly the low paid, they need to spend. They need to spend because they have competing priorities in their spending that on low wage levels they have to trade off between the two. Whereas a solid increase in the minimum wage, based on, to some extent, some of the criteria I've talked about, an increase in the minimum wage, the signalling effect that it has more broadly, is something that we believe can make a positive economic benefit.
Well, then I think if you're going to develop that argument, you need to address Mr Moss's argument, which is that if minimum wage goes up, in the current climate for business, that is going, if nothing changed, that would lead to increased costs for them. And given that small business at the moment, on Mr Moss's view, isn't confident to pass those costs along in increased prices, they'll look to cut costs, labour costs, primarily, with an increase in the minimum wage having a counterproductive effect, because the low paid will have less hours or less work.
Sure.
Do you have anything to say in relation to that?
Well, what I would say in relation to that is you started off yourself by saying assuming nothing else changes. One of the things that really, when people have done research into the impact of minimum wage increases, and you look at back at some of the classic academic research that's been done by people like Card and Kruger, that's something that we can certainly provide for the Commission. Certainly when in our previous submissions, we've cited studies where people have looked at, particularly the US, because that's an enormous source of data and an enormous sort of source of information about relative impacts of the minimum wage. You can actually see that really minimum wage increases simply do not have the deleterious and negative effects that are attributed to them. Really, when people talk about the negative effects of the minimum wage, they're starting from an assumption that there's more or less nothing else happening in the economy except the minimum wage increase. If you imagine the economy's like that, then obviously something like an increase to the minimum wage will bump a whole bunch of other things off to one side. Wages go up, hours go down. That's the classic point. When people study what actually happens in the minimum wage, when a minimum wage increases, of course there are many, many things that are happening in the economy at any given time. The classic one you might cite is what we discussed earlier, which is sort of increased consumption spending, increased consumer spending, but that's just one thing as well. Essentially, what they've found is that increases to the minimum wage, they can be modest, they can be generous, but they certainly don't have the effect. They certainly don't have the negative effects that are attributed to them, or essentially, really, there'd be very few places that economic growth could actually occur. When people have increased the minimum wage in places like the US, where they've been able to test smaller wages, next to medium-sized wage increases, next to larger wage increases, what they found is that the larger increases, or indeed the medium-sized increases, do not have the deleterious effect of constantly shoving hours down, shoving spending out of the way. Really, what is happening is that there's more money being spent, more economic activity. Economic activity is always happening, and the minimum wage increases, they benefit low-wage workers, and they benefit the economy as a whole.
Okay, and just finally, you've spoken a bit about signalling. Is the interest of UnionsWA in biannual submissions to have the low pay catch up, or is it that the signalling will lead to higher pay increases up the chain?
In our particular submission, what we're talking about is having the lower wages, or the minimum wage, sort of catch up, if you like, or using the measure of the increase in the minimum wage bite, the relativity, if you like, or the relationship between the lower paid and the higher paid, it should be closer together, or they should be small on that. And that, we would argue, is the fact that they're further apart is reflected in the increases in household inequality, inequalities in the gender pay gap, all of those sorts of things. Those are the sort of inequalities we're interested in redressing. The extent to which there's a signalling effect that goes out into the community, there are many people we've found who are on low pay, who aren't necessarily in a position to negotiate for themselves, but nevertheless need that standard to demonstrate this is a decent pay increase, this is a reasonable pay increase, this is a fair pay increase. And yes, the minimum wage does in fact play that role.
Okay, thank you.
Just one point, Dr. Garman, just when looking at your table on page 8, that is your the bite table, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
From my recollection, the ABS figures with the WATI, they don't discriminate by business type or size. They're aggregate data which look at average earnings.
It is an aggregate data.
That's what I collected. Is it possible that those figures may be skewed by larger businesses, for example, or higher paying businesses, potentially?
They certainly would reflect some of the higher earnings in higher businesses, in sort of larger businesses with higher earning people. We would argue that that's a sort of not really a bug but a feature, if I could put it like that. Part of our argument is, in fact, that all of the people who are earning the wage levels that go into average weekly earnings, they're all part of the same community. They're all part of people in the same labour market. They may not be competing with each other specifically for jobs, low skilled people, high skilled people, all of those sorts of things. But they all are counted as part of fair wage standards. And while in previous years there has been sort of arguments about, it's the mining boom, etc.,
right, yes.
Our argument with the reason why we've sort of tried to look back at things like the gender pay gap over time and the Gini coefficient over time is to basically show that even in periods where the mining boom, etc., has been coming off the boil, if I could put it like that, it really isn't reflected in sort of very much in our view by inequality declining. The gender pay gap is the obvious example with that. And I would also add that really, if our strategy to address the gender pay gap is to sort of wait for higher paid male workers to lose their jobs and then sort of the figures improve, I don't think that that's really a very good strategy. It is a consideration under the Act that the Commission must consider sort of equal remuneration, for work of equal value. That is, in our view, reason to consider the impact of the gender pay gap. We provided some information once again in our initial submission, and also our submission in reply about, for example, the Making It Fair report that was published in 2009, came out of the Federal Parliament. Basically took information from right around the country, found very clearly that increases to the minimum wage assist with the gender pay gap, assist with improving the gender pay gap. Certainly, minimum wage is not the only thing you can do, but in our view, nothing else is really going to work to improve those sorts of inequalities unless you have a strong minimum wage increase.
Thank you.
Actually, just wondered on that point. I know, Mr. Moss, you made the point about being cautious about unpacking CPI in the way that it's bundled together. The thing that jumps out on, I think it's page 11, in terms of the expenditure group, for me, childcare increased to 9.6% in your latest figures. And while clearly childcare is just one cost that working families will deal with, I just wondered whether you had a comment about how that impacts, say, in circumstances where there isn't a rise to minimum wage or the rise is one that doesn't cover that sort of a cost, whether that contributes further to any sort of gender pay gap or adverse impact on the gender sort of slant.
Well, insofar as, for example, women might be more likely to look after, to take on childcare responsibilities in the event of certain difficulties in paying for childcare. That could very well reflect a sort of an increase in sort of a decline in sort of household income, if you could put it like that, as people have to cut back their hours. In that sense, when we talk about sort of, minimum wage increases leading to reduced hours, taking on board the points that people have made about sort of, overall income levels, we shouldn't automatically assume that it's necessarily sort of a bad thing if people adjust their hours according to their pay increases accordingly. I would argue that childcare costs and also the costs of those unrecorded, unpaid costs, if you like, of looking after children are definitely something that can have an impact on the overall gender pay gap. And while there are once again many, many other things that you can do in the childcare space to make it more fair, maintaining income levels is a crucial part of that.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Stephen, in reply.
Thank you, Acting Senior Commissioner. Just have a handful of points that I'll note in reply, so I'll try to keep it brief. One of the things that has been raised, obviously, by the CCI in the proceedings is the gap between the national and the state minimum wage. And as the Minister stated in the submission in reply, certainly the Minister notes there is a gap in there, but that largely reflects the strength of the WA economy over recent years. While there is a gap, the Minister still believes that it is fair that the low paid or the minimum wage should be increased to account for the cost of living changes since the last adjustment. So, hence the Minister is still arguing for a CPI adjustment to be awarded to maintain the level of the minimum wage. Just in relation to the National Training Wage Award issue, and I thank the other parties for their support. I think everyone's broadly agrees with the principle. It's just a matter of the detail. And we're happy to have further discussions with the parties to try to come to an arrangement regarding how to implement that. We have provided a comparison document to the other Section 50 parties on the National Training Wage Award rates and the award-free minimum rates. So we'll have further discussions on that issue, as is suggested. Just a brief note on the average weekly earnings. And I note that average weekly earnings do have still a part to play in measuring things like the gender pay gap and so forth. One thing that is worth noting is that AWOT, average weekly ordinary time earnings growth, is actually growing at a much slower rate than it was, say, several years ago. The growth in the year to November 2015 was actually only 2.1% per annum, which is very similar to the wage price index growth overall as well. So AWAIRC growth is also trending down, if you like. In relation to the CPI measures of inflation, UnionsWA have highlighted some of those areas where CPI has increased by more than the overall rate. However, the Minister agrees with the CCI that really the overall rate of CPI is the best measure, and that it really shouldn't be disaggregated. Invariably there will be things that will detract from it, and Mr Christmas has highlighted some of those, such as rents and housing and transport, which have gone down in cost, and obviously others have gone up, but the overall CPI for Perth provides the most complete picture, if you like, of costs. And just in relation to household fees and charges, well, that is obviously an issue that is all factored into the rate of inflation, and similar increases in household fees and charges were in last year's budget, and that's still fed through to very low inflation rates overall. It's also worth noting that those fees and charges will also be experienced by many employers as well. So many employers will also face similar increases in fees and charges. Apart from that, that pretty much concludes the Minister's right of reply.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jenkins, what do you say about UnionsWA's projection for AWAIRC to be 1,764.80 in May 2017?
Yes, that assumes a growth in AWAIRC of about 4.35%. That would actually require a very large increase to come through in the next 6 monthly figures. So while we don't forecast AWAIRC either, I suspect that the actual figure will come out lower than that, because the annual rates at the moment are growing by a much lower amount. So we think it will come out something below that.
Thank you, Mr. Ingram. Mr. Moss.
Thank you. Look, in response to UnionsWA's further submissions, I'll refer back to our submissions in reply. Just as a couple of points, we'd note that the decline in the mining sector and the resource industries, which are quite high paid employment and largely dominated, that the further decline in those industries will have a flow-on effect on the gender pay gap over time. In particular, it's worth noting that the WOTI data that's been referred to is November, and of course, whilst that is the most relevant data, the 6-monthly increments of that data makes it difficult for a more real-time comparison. And we'd also note that reduction in wages has a lag effect. Whilst increases in wages can occur more readily, a decrease in wage takes time, either by negotiating differences with existing employees, renegotiating agreements, or the impact on turnover of labour and lower wages for new entrants into it. So
there's a long way to go, though, isn't there?
There is, but we would expect that we would see movement naturally in that gap declining with the changes in market forces. And we have started to see the decline of 0.9% from November 2014 to November 2015 is not in itself an insignificant decline in the gender pay gap. And I think one of the things that CCI has noted in our submissions, the gender pay gap is an issue of concern. I think everyone on the bar table has an equal concern with respect to the gender pay gap. The question is, what are the potential solutions? And our view is that increases in the minimum wage don't have a significant impact or any impact on the gender pay gap. There are other triggers that we think are more relevant to addressing that issue.
Parliament obviously disagrees with you, doesn't it? Because it specifically included that at Roman 7, 50A3A, 50 capital A3A. Parliament says we need to provide equal remuneration for men and women for work of equal or comparable value. Parliament disagrees with you, doesn't it?
I suspect that that question might, the answer to that question might differ depending on when you ask that question in Parliament, because those provisions were inserted a while ago. Having said that, the issue for the Commission to consider, there's a requirement for the Commission to consider the gender pay gap in its deliberations, not necessarily an obligation that the Commission take, that there is a particular outcome that the Commission must conclude with respect to that.
In any event, the requirement is to consider equal remuneration for men and women for work of equal or comparable value, of which the gender pay gap is one component.
Yes.
There are other considerations such as ensuring, there are other considerations such as the distinction between those rates for those callings which are traditionally male and those which are traditionally female, which are not as traditional as they once were, but issues of work value have challenged those remuneration levels over the years, haven't they? There have been work value cases brought to challenge the question of equal value for equal remuneration for those callings which are said to have equal skill levels, quite separately from those positions which attract higher rates, which happen to be traditionally male.
I suspect one of the issues for consideration is, there's the provisions with respect to equal remuneration decisions, which look at, the work value associated with particular industries.
Yes.
And the impact of gender
And particular
with respect
callings.
to that and callings. In the case of state wage case, we're looking at across the board rather than looking at specific industry or occupational
Yes.
types. And I think it's harder to bring the two into correlation when we're looking at the state wage case as distinct from the considerations that we would look at with an equal remuneration order. One of the other issues we'd raise is with respect to the impact of increases in wages on employment. We've identified in our submissions and reply we do caution the use of international studies in trying to identify the cause and effect, particularly when we're looking at things like United States and UK models where they have a vastly different industrial relations system, and in particular one which doesn't have the award type system that we have in Australia, where you've just simply got a minimum wage. But more to the point, Dr. Diamond's raised, well, if nothing else is happening in the economy and other things are happening in the economy, one of the points to take into consideration with the evidence has been from Treasury and our own submissions as to what's happening in the economy. Our clear view is the economy is contracting, and that I think is an important thing to consider when we're looking at increases in minimum wage and what's happening in the economy more generally. We're seeing contraction, not expansion, and that we think is an appropriate consideration. May it please the Commission with my comments.
Thank you all for your submissions. We will, as usual, reconvene once the Fair Work Commission has issued its annual wage review decision. We don't yet know when that's likely to be. If you would kindly have your discussions about the national training wage award either prior to that, and either advise us before we reconvene or when we reconvene. That would be most helpful. Thank you. We'll adjourn.